This is Ambreen Ali.
And this is David Mayorga.
You're listening to Exit Interview, a conversation with Princeton SPIA graduates about their senior year research.
Sam, thank you so much for spending some time with us and talking about your thesis. I'm really excited to learn more about it. Can we just start with your name, where you grew up, and your major?
Yeah, my name's Sam Chiang. I grew up in New York. I'm a SPIA major here at Princeton.
Okay, so let's just dive in. Let's start with kind of just a little bit of a summary of what your thesis was about in your own words.
Yeah, so my thesis was about how the Ukrainians have sort of prevailed in the past 3 years fighting against the Russians in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And sort of outnumbered and outgunned, right? No one really thought the Ukrainians would stand a chance. Most military analysts around the world believed that Ukraine would fall in a matter of days when Russia invaded in 2022. And that hasn't been the case. And so my thesis sort of sought to answer the question of, well, how has Ukraine persisted? And I believe that it's the emergence of these FPV drones. So first-person view drones are essentially sort of commercially produced drones actually pioneered by violent non-state actors in the Middle East. And Ukrainians have sort of adapted this consumer technology where you can take a $1,000 drone, retrofit it with explosives, and then target enemy, personnel and equipment. And it sort of allows you to create a situation in which normally outnumbered and outgunned adversary can force the Russians, who typically use more sort of larger mass formation battle tactics, and you can force them to adapt those tactics to pursue more guerrilla warfare-like-esque methods because essentially these FPV drones are so deadly that they force the Russians to seek cover and then only engage in smaller and less direct methods of warfare.
Yeah. So it's interesting because guerrilla warfare has always been a thing, but because of these drones, the risk to the Ukrainians is pretty low, right? Because their soldiers can be far away when they're operating the drones.
Yeah, exactly. So I think these FPV drones are relatively revolutionary in the sense that, never before in a battlefield have you been able to sit sort of, kilometers away in a bunker and deploy these drones with devastating success and extreme precision, right? In the past, you could sort of use artillery, which we've seen a lot in the Russo-Ukrainian war, but it doesn't offer that level of precision that an FPV drone does. And then sort of beyond the direct strike capabilities of these drones, they also serve as important surveillance in ISR platforms. And so you can use these drones for reconnaissance, planning out missions, providing live commands for sort of combined arms attacks. And so the opportunities are endless with them.
So ultimately, it's given the Ukrainians kind of a leg up in what should have been kind of an asymmetrical war, right?
Exactly.
And as a result, they're still fighting. I'm sure a lot of other countries are watching this happen and thinking about kind of how they can leverage drones and other technology in this way moving forward. And I know that's part of what your thesis was about. So what did you kind of conclude in the end in terms of how to manage the situation or, what the United States in particular should be doing about it?
Yeah, so I think drones are going to play a really important role in the on the battlefields of the future, particularly in the skies overhead. I think one important limitation I want to sort of shout out here is that drones don't hold territory, soldiers do. And so there's sort of limitations right now to what these drones can really do. With that being said, I do think, the United States has already begun developing these drones and sort of developing ways to produce them and deploy them as well, as we've seen many countries do. And so from the U.S. perspective, right, it's pretty interesting. You need to look at it from a deploying perspective of, how can you use these drones? They offer, soldiers on a tactical level an unprecedented battlefield advantage. But then you also need to think about how to respond to them, right? Because what we've seen with the United States is they're typically the stronger, for the past 100 years or so, they've been the stronger power in these wars. And so when you think about, how they're going to be used in the future, right, it's really that we're going to see a lot of these violent non-state actors using them against the United States. We've already seen this in Syria where U.S. Special Operations Command has been, particularly scared by how these FPV drones were striking their soldiers in the sense that the U.S. didn't have proper countermeasures at the time and was slow to develop them. And so when we think about how the U.S. as this massive war power can be seen, on battlefields in the future, other countries are going to deploy them, right? Because the opportunities for those countries from a value proposition of using a $1,000 drone to take down a U.S. soldier who's been trained for hundreds of thousands of dollars, or a U.S. tank that costs also $100,000, maybe millions of dollars. there's real opportunity there for them. And then from the other perspective, right, you need to think about how the U.S. can equip its allies with these drones and then train its allies as well. And so there's sort of a lot of opportunities and, a lot of examples, a lot of cases for where the U.S. needs to sort of develop further on this.
What I'm not hearing is that you can rein in this technology, and it sounds like that's not going to happen, right?
No, I don't think it's going to happen. You can see online there are these commercials published by U.S. defense companies like Anduril, where you see these massive swarms of drones. And the reality is, I do think they're sort of a way of fighting wars in the future because they're so cheap, right? You can build these drones for simply like $1,000, retrofit them with a shaped charge. And then deploy them in waves. And so you could send, hundreds of these drones, thousands of these drones in a wave. And the countermeasures right now are pretty limited, right? Because to sort of take down these drones, they're very difficult to shoot down. Jamming technology doesn't always work. And, maybe if your jamming technology works to a 99% efficacy rate, if there's 100 drones, right, that means one still strikes its target. And so that's where it gets dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a step back. Tell me about kind of your interest in war and conflict. How did this kind of come about? And where did you get the idea of focusing on FPV drones for your thesis?
Yeah, I think growing up, it's sort of funny. I was always really interested in armed conflict and how the United States sort of played a role in that. I think that was a pretty big part of my childhood. And then when I got to Princeton, I sort of took a few classes that were kind of made me more interested in the space. And so one of them was this science and global security class I took through SPIA. That sort of taught me about how emerging technology is used on battlefields. I took a class about my junior SPIA policy task force with Professor Pinzon. Was about unleashing Latin American development, and I learned a lot more sort of about like the economics behind, the economics behind what powers states forward. And I think that there's sort of this economic interest in drones because they're so cheap and they offer that unique value proposition there. And then he also was the Colombian Minister of Defense, and so sort of an underlying interest in asymmetrical warfare there. And then this past year, I took another politics seminar on violent non-state actors in the Middle East. That was sort of a really good opportunity for me to learn more about these violent non-state actors and how they've been using FPV drones and actually been using them against the United States. And so sort of a combination of all those interests.
That's so interesting. I mean, if you kind of pull back on all of those experiences and things you've learned, like what is kind of your big takeaway from what you've studied? Like, do you feel like war is changing a lot in this current moment? Is it going to be completely different moving forward? Do we see less conflict or more conflict as a result?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting with these drones is there's this theory of the body bag syndrome in which when there are less body bags being sent home, as in less soldiers are dying, it enables democratic powers to be a little bit more aggressive. And I sort of think that because these drones are really, they're sort of thought of as disposable, right? Because they're so cheap, it sort of means that we probably will see more conflict in the future. And then also, when you sort of think about the geopolitical implications right now with great power competition, and how, the world is a very dangerous place. I think we've sort of seen that it continues to be a dangerous place. And unfortunately, the future, is also a very scary world. And so when you think about these drones and how they're changing warfare, they enable nations from really strong powers like the United States that have always, historically wielded aerial assets that cost millions of dollars. And now, you sort of enable violent non-state actors and other, non-traditional actors with very limited access to resources. They can now build these drones, and it sort of increases their capabilities tenfold. Right?
Yeah. I wanted to ask kind of how working on this thesis kind of is shaping what you're going to do next. I imagine that you won't be doing anything like this in the job that you're taking immediately after you graduate, but did it make you think that there's anything about this area that you might want to kind of incorporate into your career at some point, or did you feel any sort of sense of what you might be able to do about what you've learned?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things that are important to me. I think the first is, at some point in my career, I really want to serve my country. And that can take a few different forms. The way I sort of envision it right now is being a U.S. ambassador later on in life. Maybe the ambassador to the United Nations would be nice, or Secretary of Defense, something like that. So sort of a really high aspirations there, and we'll sort of see what happens. I think for something I can take forward in the near term, it's really being on the edge, like the cutting edge of technological innovation. I think I've always been really interested in sort of how, new technology is developed. In the past, we've seen, sort of dual-use technology coming out of the military. And so when you look at like GPS and radar, right, like those are all military inventions that were then sort of adapted for the civilian use. And now, right, it's sort of, you see the reverse in which civilian technology is being used for fighting wars. And so I sort of like to, think a little bit more about that and see how I can stay up to date.
Yeah, that's a fun observation about how that's flipped. And I wanted to, one thing that was really impressive about your thesis, just the level of research that went into it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Did you conduct interviews in addition to doing kind of background research, or what was kind of the primary research methods you used?
Yeah, so I actually didn't conduct interviews, unfortunately. I didn't, I think in the old days of SPIA, I would have been able to, I guess this is the old days. There was a guy who embedded with U.S. Armed Forces in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that, so I wasn't able to conduct interviews. But I sort of, wanted to collect some material from the front line for more of like a qualitative explanation of what's been happening. And for that, there's a lot of good frontline reporting out there of podcasts and news articles of soldiers reporting on their situations. And so that was really interesting to sort of collect and read about those firsthand accounts. But then really the majority of my thesis sort of focused on more of a quantitative analysis. And so there's this Ukrainian data scientist in combination with the general staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and they've published a data set on how these FPV drones have been used. And so I was sort of able to combine that data set with ACLID data and some other data resources to kind of sort of think about how these drones have been effective in taking down Russian soldiers and equipment into other targets for the Ukrainians. And the results of that were really interesting, right? Because you sort of find that even though these FPV drones are less effective compared to traditional airstrikes, when they're present on the battlefield, they offer numerous opportunities, right? So they can be direct strike capable, they can be direct strike platforms. They can also sort of serve intelligence functions. And when you sort of combine all of those, capabilities, you increase the deadliness of Ukrainian defending forces, and that sort of becomes really, really important for them in these engagements.
Mm. You mentioned the qualitative data. Did you go down any social media rabbit holes? I imagine there's a lot of footage.
Yes, I definitely did. Some of that was quite jarring. I watched a lot of it on X, and it sort of got really deep on Telegram, honestly. I think what was quite fun for me was going down Russian Telegram. And so, obviously you can get into some dark places there, but there's sort of a lot of information perpetrating the internet right now. And I think that's sort of one thing that really was interesting to me, I guess, about the Russo-Ukrainian war in general, is that when you have this sort of social media coverage in which like soldiers on the ground, there was reports that soldiers on the ground were being targeted for cell phone usage. And that was how Ukrainians were identifying, Russian hotspots to strike. And so when you think about how, every soldier these days sort of has their own cell phone on them and can sort of post information online about it, you get like these really interesting accounts of the war that you wouldn't really see in wars of the past, right? Because that information either wasn't collected or hasn't survived. And, we're living in a very interesting time.
Yeah, so interesting. Okay, well, you are done with your thesis and you've defended it and all that, but there are incoming seniors next year that are going to be starting this journey. If you had to go back to kind of when you got started, is there like a piece of advice you'd give yourself or that you would offer to those who are going to get started soon?
Yeah, definitely. I think I sort of got lost sometimes doing a lot of research because you can sort of fall down these rabbit holes. And so my recommendation would be, as soon as you do research, like taking notes is good. Integrating it into your outline is even better. And so as soon as you're doing research, really try to add it to your outline immediately. And so you don't forget about it later, because, I ended up finding a lot of good bits of gold sort of searching through my research files at the end that I sort of wished I'd incorporated earlier. And so putting those in as early as possible is always helpful.
That's great. And I imagine being really organized, because
Yes.
it's a lot of notes.
Yes. It gets to be a lot. So find a good citation tool and yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so last question, just what are you most proud of in what you've produced and in just kind of the process that you've gone through in creating this thesis?
Yeah, I think I'm proudest about the sort of challenges I've overcome. I think when you sort of think about collecting the data, being used in an active war, it's very difficult, right? Because there's not very much data that exists. And if that data does exist, it's not, necessarily given out to the public because of the sort of intrinsic value in being able to have a data set on how effective, a relatively new technology has been on the battlefield, because that sort of being able to determine that efficacy rate is very valuable for militaries, right? And so sort of being able to sort of create my own data set and then analyze it in a sense of when, unfortunately, right, in the data set I was able to compile, there was a lot of data indigeneity concerns. And that was sort of obviously that's a bad thing, right? And so being able to use different statistical methods to try to remove that was obviously a big challenge for me and something I was really proud to overcome.
Oh, that's fantastic. Awesome, Sam. Well, thank you so much for your time and for telling us about your thesis, and congratulations on both the thesis and graduating.
Thank you.
Best of luck.
Thank you.